Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana, Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. Very excited today to welcome Dr. Sean McFate to speak with us about the new rules of war, his book about how America can win against Russia, China, and other threats. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about the other threats. He's a foreign policy expert, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, professor of strategy at Georgetown. But what we're going to be talking to him about in a few minutes was his role as a private military contractor because of his background as a paratrooper officer in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division and what his bio says, jump master. I'm very excited to talk with him today because he brings to us a perspective on what is going on today, Nick. And I wanted to mention, fresh off the presses, I saw the New York Times posting that China no longer needs Wall Street. So if China no longer leads Wall Street, America needs a new strategy to win against China. And this is based on China's equivalent of Uber, a $39 billion DD company, car service company, delisting today. And this summer, it was the darling. Institutional investors were falling over themselves to give them money, and now they've delisted. China no longer needs Wall Street. When I say that, what does that make you think about our U.S. strategy and people on the ground here?
It's a worrying development because it is a sign that all roads, and particularly all financial roads, don't necessarily lead to and through the United States, which therefore is a lessening of our influence. If you're not listing on our markets, you're not subject to our regulations, you're not subject to our rules for currency. Those have been ways we've been able to influence. And also, it is part of this gradual step of China, Russia, some of the other players trying to extricate themselves from the U.S. financial and business systems. And where it means down the line is not just simply does it affect jobs in New York, but over time it affects the willingness of people to want to continue to hold dollars. And it's the willingness of people to continue using dollars that keeps our currency attractive as a reserve and allows us to basically run deficits, including all the stimulus packages we've been having over the last couple of years without having to raise taxes. So it is a worrying step. It's part of this decoupling process. And as you decouple, and you don't feel you need each other, it raises the possibility that you might see more open conflict in the years to come.
Yeah, I really wanted to mention this today because I agree with you completely. And you've been tweeting a little bit on our Doorstep podcast Twitter handle. For our audience, please follow us about this idea of, is the dollar no longer supreme? And I think, we'll keep following this trend and keep looking at what this means as the new year comes.
It's been a very good discussion, and also for some of our former Doorstep guests like Rachel Ziemba have been contributing to that conversation on Twitter as well. So it has real implications for doorstep issues here in the United States.
The other doorstep implication, I think Sean really brings it home, and we'll speak to him in a minute, but this idea that America and China and the way that they're dealing with, and the different ways they're dealing with the rest of the world. So as Sean mentions, it's not just the top 30 countries, it's the rest of the 160 that we need to look at and think about, including those in Africa. We recently had our Africa podcast and guest, but this Al Jazeera piece I thought was really interesting, with the idea that backsliding on the part of Western powers and the rise of autocratic friendly China has created an atmosphere in Africa that emboldens generals and military cliques to seize power. We're seeing a lot of coups over the last few months in Africa, Sudan being the latest, the US not knowing how to deal with it. China's, the way they approach politics in countries they're investing in is no problem, whatever you guys want to do. And I think this is going to lead to an increasingly problematic role of the US around the world. What do you think?
I think so. And again, tying it back to when we had Howard French as our Doorstep podcast guest a few weeks back, during his time when he was a bureau chief traveling through Africa, and the sense at the time in the 90s that African governments felt that they had to conform to democratic standards because, again, going back to your first question about delisting from US markets, in the 90s, the US was the only game in town, really. You wanted business, you wanted trade, you wanted investment. You had to play by certain rules. And as you have said now, the increased role of China over the last number of years gives countries, if they dispense with democratic norms, and the United States and Western Europe say we're going to impose sanctions, and they can say, well, but we can do business with China that does not care about democratic norms. Now, China may exact a price in a different area, much more onerous business terms, but certainly that has changed the game. And the other thing that has changed the game, and that is a wonderful point of connectivity to our guest who will be joining us momentarily, is not only do you have the increased Chinese economic lifeline, so to speak, the rise of private military companies and mercenary groups, including Russian ones, especially active in Africa, give you the opportunity to make your bid for power. And the Central African Republic just inaugurated a monument this past week to Russian mercenaries. It's a statue of Russian mercenaries in the downtown square of the capital to essentially thank them for their role in fending off different rebel groups. So definitely the environment is changing.
Wow. And we will talk to Sean about that. Before we go, I want to mention two things for our listeners. Is militarization essential for security in 2022 and beyond? A Carnegie panel on December 14th at 3 p.m. With a lot of special guests, including our fearless leader, Joel Rosenthal, but also Elliot Ackerman, who we spoke with about his novel 2034 and a book talk this year. Please sign up, join up. It's going to follow along with our Doorstep podcast very well. And then join us for our final Doorstep podcast of 2021. I can't believe this year's almost over. On December 15th with Executive Director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service, Mo Alithi. He will help us understand what has happened in foreign policy and domestic policy in 2021 and what we can expect in 2022. Thank you, and let's get to Sean. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today. We're so excited to speak to you after meeting with you a couple of weeks ago at the Carnegie New Leaders Conference here in New York, where you spoke so eloquently about your book, The New Rules of War, and got us excited or scared about the idea of the rise of private military armies. And so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about, what America should be doing and how we can connect that to Main Street concerns. And I think that's what we try here to do at the Doorstep, to try to give our audience a perspective on here's what's going on around the world, and we need to be talking about it more at home. So congratulations on the New Rules of War.
Thank you.
It's a fabulous look at, as you say in the subhead, how America can win against Russia, China, and other threats. So initially look at what America needs to do better. Maybe we can start with the graph that you showed us that blew me away. How much America spends on its military.
Well, this is a stunning number that I think most taxpayers intuitively know, but when they see it in the graph, form of a graph, it's just unmistakable. We spend more money on our military. Well, let's back up. We spend more money on the Department of Defense than any other department or agency in the federal government. In fact, we spend more on the Department of Defense than all the other departments combined, right? So over half of our federal discretionary spending goes to the military compared to education, EPA, State Department, agriculture. And globally, we spend more money in our military than the next 10 biggest militaries in the world combined, including China, including Russia, including all of our adversaries. So in other words, we take our military very seriously.
What does that mean on the ground, though? Because though Americans know it intuitively, like when I talk to my students, they really don't understand what the military means today. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, I would argue the military doesn't know what the military means today, because we're spending money on weapon systems that were really tooled to fight 20th century threats, and we're in the 21st century. We're spending, for example, the F-35 is a jet fighter plane that is, we are spending $1.7 trillion on this single seat airplane for the whole program. And it's not just us, it's our allies too. And to give you some scope about how big that number is, how many zeros that is for like a liberal arts guy like me, that is more than Russia's GDP on a single seat airplane. And in fact, if this airplane, the F-35, were a country, its GDP would be ranked 11th in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia. Now, we've been at war for at least 20 years in at least 2 places. You'd think that the F-35 would be, basically winning the day for us. It has 0 combat missions, 0. Now, the measure of worth of any weapon system, ethical or not, is how much you use it. So it's like having a Ferrari in the garage that you never actually take out to drive because you don't want it to run over a speed bump. And that's what the F-35 is. In fact, you can argue, when was the last time there was a strategic dogfight? The Korean War. That's like 60, 70 years ago. Why do we even need fighter jets in the 21st century? Why do we need manned fighter jets in the 21st century? But the Department of Defense thinks we need them urgently. And we're buying more of these suckers, which cost the same as like 2 737s. And they don't go to war. And the first time one gets shot down, the world's going to freak out. Because now this exquisite weapon system, it's like on a pedestal where what it actually can do in the battlefield matters less than the symbology of that it represents of American power. So anybody can shoot an F-35 down will be much more of a victory internationally, politically, than whatever battlefield leverage it can give us. So I would argue that the military doesn't know what, it's having an identity crisis about what is war, what is the future of war. Meanwhile, they're spending like bandits.
Does any country, in your view, know what the future of war is?
Oh, yes.
And I'm going to ask number one, because you tweeted this great article about what's happening with Iran and Israel. And I want to bring it up to our listeners, if you can answer that in 2 parts.
Well, I would say that I think everybody other than the West, quote unquote, knows what the future of war is because it's already here. It simply looks like the future to us because we are mired in the past. There's a saying that generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. Well, that happens to be true. And our last war, if we're honest, was 1945. Every war the US has fought, if we're honest, has been a stalemate or a loss against low-level actors like the Taliban and the North Vietnamese. And they understand that war is more than battlefield victory, it's armed politics. And we get the battlefield stuff right, but we fail the politics. Hence the saying, you can win every battle but lose the war. That's what we've been doing for decades now. So if we lose against the Taliban, what does it mean we have to go up against Russia and China, who do understand the current environment for warfare, and they do fight it well? We are going to, and they also, part of their strategies to keep us in the dark, which we can talk about. But how some of the best weapons today in warfare don't fire bullets. There are things like disinformation, trying to sabotage democracy so that you collapse democracies from within. You don't have to do a blitzkrieg anymore. You find other ways to take them down. So that's actually the present of the war. It just looks futuristic to us because we're so stuck in, John Wayne version of warfare.
Yeah, that raises, I think, some critical questions as we move forward, because on the one hand, as you said, we're spending these large amounts of money on weapon systems that are essentially, as you said, on a pedestal. Great to look at. We really don't want to use them. We certainly don't want to lose any of them. And so we want to avoid those kinds of set pieces, while people are then asking, why are we spending so much on a military if it's not actually going to provide the security that we need? And on the other hand, I think that this environment that you say that we're moving into the mid 21st century, banks, not tanks, Facebook, not F-35s, germs, not guns. I mean, all of these ways in which a society can be attacked and it can be compelled to do things seems to suggest a radically different way of approaching international conflict. Do you see that the U.S. is able to, both the national security establishment, but also the society is able to evolve towards thinking about what it means to be in competition and conflict under these types of conditions?
No, it's a great question, Nick. And the answer is yes, we are completely able to achieve this. It's not like we were born in some bad geopolitical area like Germany in the 19th century, right? Between, enemies. The problem is our way of thinking. It's not, in some ways, it's not like we need some super weapon. It's the way that we think. Our paradigm of warfare is obsolete. Everybody else gets this. We do not. We've been lapped. They exploit this, and they try to. What that means specifically is that to us, we think of warfare like battlefield victory, like the Battle of Midway or Gettysburg. And the truth is, we all remember mission accomplished in 2003 in Iraq when George Bush was standing on an aircraft carrier saying, "Hey, we won in Iraq because we achieved perfect battlefield victory against the Iraqi army." It meant nothing for the war. So battlefield victory is becoming obsolete in warfare. And what matters more are things that don't look like warfare to us. And that's what our enemies and adversaries do. If you can wage war, but disguise it as peace to your adversary, you're halfway to winning. So that's why they use like cyber weapons. Well, is that war? Is that peace? We don't know. They weaponize refugees, as Belarus has done on Poland and the EU border. They do things like use mercenaries. Russia uses mercenaries in Africa and the Middle East. Well, we don't think of mercenaries. We think of them as cheap Hollywood villains, and our intelligence community doesn't really collect on them. So they're an excellent tool to do, expeditionary operations. Disinformation, deep fakes, fake tweets. We don't think of those as acts of war, so we don't respond. And that's what our adversaries do. They know that we think of war like pregnancy. You either are or you're not, or like a light switch with no dimmer. It's either on or off. And they know that we always have that switch to off. And if we ever flip that switch to on, like we did after 9/11, the US is going to come after you. So what they do is they keep on they play a game of chicken like China does in the South China Sea. They go right up to that line where we will flip that light switch to on, and then they stop, but they keep everything they've captured, right? Russia does the same thing in different ways. And that's this gradual incrementalism, and that's what's gaining them international power. We think of war as like 4 years, like World War II, a couple months like Gulf War I. But war is, strategic patience and being cunning wins the day, not F-35s and Ford class carriers and all this other stuff.
I think to one of your points, cyber weapons, the article that you mentioned about Iran and Israel, crossfire of a cyber war, things like little things that don't seem like war, right? The lead, if you can indulge me in the article you tweeted, in Tel Aviv, a well-known broadcaster panicked as the intimate details of his sex life and those of hundreds of thousands of others stolen from an LGBTQ dating site were uploaded on social media. For years, Iran and Israel have engaged in covert war by land, sea, air, and computer, but the targets have usually been military or government related. Now the cyber war has widened to target civilians at a large scale. And so is this the way we bring it to the doorstep finally, that people understand war in a different way when we're targeted? And I speak as someone whose college was cyber targeted just 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
I don't know.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I don't know who it was. I'm just saying. Is this how we join the civilians?
Right. And I think, first of all, what we're also seeing in the 21st century is that warfare is the distinction in the laws of armed conflict between combatants and non-combatants has been increasingly blurred and deliberately blurred. It's not accidentally blurred anymore. And we see this in all sorts of ways, including cyber. And this idea of defamation, et cetera, is a big issue. The idea of using disinformation to sway close elections, that is how you fight war. I mean, who cares about the sword if you can manipulate the mind that wields it? Who cares about how many F-35s the US has if you can help put in a president who's sympathetic to your national interests? And that's the forefront of warfare, and it's an aggregate of multiple things like this. Like if you could, if you could do a WikiLeaks on the United States, like it's been done, and facilitate that and create division and distrust between a government and its people, that's just one more pinprick. I mean, we keep on, as Americans, we want the big sword that slaughters the enemy, but that's not how warfare is. It's never worked that way, right? It's multiple pricks on multiple axes. Some are sneaky, some are not. And this idea of targeting civilians, that will bring it in. But the problem with cyber is attribution. So you never know exactly who does it. And also there's something called false flag operations, which is where you frame an enemy. So like one thing that Russia could do is kind of stir the pot between China and the United States and make it look like China is doing cyber attacks in the United States, so the United States, retaliates and attacks China. And, getting two enemies to fight each other is a pretty old ploy. Cyber and other types of things like cyber today allow people to do the technologies we have, like deep fakes and so forth, and cyber attacks. They allow a lot of deviousness and cunningness in warfare. So people, if they can actually see the direct linkage between an adversarial state and their personal life and threatening them, that might help. Because remember, in the Cold War, you never had to do this. The Soviet Union, nuclear Armageddon, that was there. But today, our enemies and adversaries disguise the threats so that we live in our cocoon. They like us in our cocoon.
So I think that's an interesting point, that particularly these new cyber tools allow for adversaries not just to target the top level, but they can bring it down to individuals. And so that point about, how would you feel if you're on one of the dating apps and all of that information is now, it can be used to embarrass you or to create difficulties. So in some ways, you're saying these new tools allow for that direct, to be touched directly by an adversary. But I want to also then go to another side of the new rules of war that you've been looking at and that you've been discussing, and that is the ability of countries to take military operations and to remove them really from the day-to-day doorstep. And what I'm thinking about here is the increased use of private military companies, because, you know, politically, we've always been told that there's a threshold, only so many people can, you know, be killed in a conflict before there's a public reaction. But it does seem that if you're shifting more to the private military side, it gives countries the ability to send people in without having that domestic political trigger of boots on the ground, or our sons and daughters, or what are our sons and daughters being risked for. Can you talk a bit about this dynamic of the return? Because it really is, historically speaking, a return to an older tradition of professional military experts available for hire, rather than, you know, relying on the volunteer or conscript forces of a country in order to engage in military activity. Are we really going to see this continued trend towards not only countries, but perhaps also private actors, big corporations being able to field pretty sophisticated military operations?
It's a great question. I think, and I've been arguing for well over 10 years, that the increased privatization of warfare is one of the biggest insecurity threats of the 21st century, and it gets almost no attention. You know, terrorism gets attention, China and Russia get attention, but look how Russia is using, you know, mercenaries. Russia is doing expeditionary operations into two continents now, Africa and the Middle East, the first time since the 1980s. Their leading spear tip, it's not Spetsnaz special forces or Russian troops or little green men, it's mercenaries like the Wagner group. And it's not just Russia, it's everybody. I mean, earlier this year, in July of 2021, the president of Haiti was assassinated by Colombian mercenaries. We have mercenaries fighting other mercenaries in Libya today. It's like a medieval warfare, right? We don't know exactly who's on the ground, what they're fighting for, and why. We know there's a lot of, you have Russian mercenaries, Turkish mercenaries, Egyptian. When I say Turkish mercenaries, I don't mean they're like all Turkish people. It's like, what it is the Turkish regime is going out and finding mercenaries who speak different languages from all over the world to go into Libya and fight, right? We see Yemen full of mercenaries. We see billionaires hiring mercenaries. So some of you may know Carlos Ghosn. He was the former chairman and CEO of Nissan Motors. He was arrested in 2019 in Tokyo for corruption, and he has been under house arrest in Tokyo under the national police and under Japanese intelligence. He secretly hired American Green Beret mercenary to do an exfiltration like a CIA James Bond op, and they got him out under the noses of Japanese authorities into Lebanon, which has no extradition treaty, right? And every billionaire's light bulb went off saying, oh, I have a get out of jail free card. I don't have to be accountable as much as I used to. Multinational corporations are looking at this private warfare sector because if you're ExxonMobil and you're in Africa or the Middle East, you don't want to depend from their point of view on like corrupt host nations. You'd rather take charge of your own security. And we're getting into an era where, maybe ExxonMobil one day will have its own private army. Maybe Elon Musk someday will have its own private army. Maybe a mega church in the United States will have its own private army to do humanitarian Christian interventions, right? So the reason why this is, literally an exploding sector in international relations that's not getting covered is that mercenaries do a lot of things very well. I don't mean morally well. I mean, warfare well. First of all, let's be realistic. Mercenaries are the second oldest profession, right? The world that we grew up in sixth grade that said that the world war is only a privilege of nation states, that is manifestly untrue. For most of human history, anybody who could swipe a check could wage war for any reason they wanted, no matter how petty. The super rich were superpowers. So if you look at the Middle Ages in Europe, that's how wars were fought, mercenaries. popes hired mercenary armies. That's how the Romans conquered the world. They had legions, but around each legions was a cohorts of mercenaries or sellswords or whatever you want. Even the Old Testament talks about this, and never with any shame. So they are good because they're cheaper. Like it's like renting a car is cheaper than owning one. They are less dangerous because having a standing military, historically, they can wage a palace coup where they can take things over. Those who have been to Milan may know this, is that Milan, for a dynasty, had the Sforza dynasty in the Middle Ages, was started by warlord mercenaries. But the real reason we're seeing them today, like why do countries like Russia use mercenaries? Because they have a very good military. Why do they use it? Well, a few reasons. One, Nick, that you raise is that if you have a population which is casualty adverse, it's better to hire mercenaries, because Russians, just like Americans, they freak out when they see dead soldiers coming home in body bags, but they do not care about dead contractors. They are disposable people. Even if they're Americans or Russians, they do not care. The second reason is that because we live in an information age, weapons that give you plausible deniability are now more important than lethality. That's why the F-35 is pretty useless today, because just flying it over a country is an act of war. But if you could use covert means like mercenaries, because even if you capture mercenaries, like in Haiti, those mercenaries, they may not know who they work for. And you don't, just because they're Colombian doesn't mean they're working for the Colombian government, because there's so many cutouts. That mercenaries are ideal ways to fight modern wars beneath the threshold of the global media. And if you want to win wars, you fight it beneath the threshold of global media, NGOs, etc. That's how Putin took Ukraine. He created the fog of war in Ukraine, used mercenaries and special forces and little green men. And when the West was still trying to figure out what the heck was going on the ground, the Crimea was a fait accompli. And only then did he pull back the curtain and say, ha, 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 it's been us all along. And he keeps the Crimea. That's how wars are fought. Not with aircraft carriers or F-35s, but these sneaky ways, like mercenaries, because they give you plausible deniability, and they allow you to take greater risks, and they lower the barriers of entry into conflict.
Can I just ask, because I think some of the listeners might be intrigued by this. We talk about mercenaries, and people may have this, that there's a bar somewhere in the world that you walk in and there's people sort of, standing around, and then wild geese or something like that. But really, it's a growing sector. In Afghanistan, the contractor private military sector was the second largest contributor at one point after the United States of personnel. Who works in this sector? It's a growth sector. I mean, how do people get, is there you teach at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, of which both your co-hosts here are proud alumni. I don't recall like a track that was a mercenary track or at the career fair where someone would say, come work for the government, come work for Citibank, come work for Goldman Sachs. Oh, by the way, come work for, or maybe that is now, maybe they are at the career fair. But I mean, who's going into these fields and how are they recruiting people?
Yeah.
What's the dynamic? And is it a growth? Are we going to see more Americans perhaps saying, this looks like a lucrative profession, and I might be more interested in doing it?
Yeah, well, okay. So for Carnegie Council listeners who want to pursue a mercenary career, I would say this. Look, I was in this industry for many years, and then I had an epiphany at one point that I looked around, there weren't many old people in my industry. And so I started to rethink my life choices. I happened to be in Burundi at the time, in Africa, and ended up getting out. But I've kept close ties inside the industry, including places like the Wagner Group, including places like Columbia, not just English speaking. The industry has changed. And I would say this, is that, first of all, there's lots to say. there are volumes of academic and legal ink have been spilt on differentiating a private military company from a mercenary operation. In truth, the line is very blurry. If you have the skill set to do one, you have the skill set to do the other. And that really that line is more a euphemism. So the United States called Blackwater a private military company, but most of the world viewed them as mercenaries. Moscow calls the Wagner Group a private military company, but everybody else sees them as mercenaries. And the people, the skill sets are the same. They're basically, what is a mercenary / private military company? You're a foreign person doing paramilitary operations in a foreign land, chiefly for profit. I mean, that's the simplest way of doing it. You're not doing, you're not being a mall guard. You're doing paramilitary things, and those could be either direct action, which is like combat missions. Two, it's training and equipping, like professionalizing other forces. That's a military mission. Or three, what we call non-permissive strategic reconnaissance, where you go into a place like Iran or to the Congo, and your client is a gold mining company, and they want to verify the asset is there, it's not being run by a warlord, etc. So those are typical mercenary activities today. Now, the pay is all over the place. And think of the mercenary industry as a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid are tier 3 actors. These are just kind of like low-level infantry type guys who they guard oil infrastructure. And at the top, there's tier 2 who are a little bit better. And at the top are tier 1, they're like special forces guys. And you see a lot of ex-SEALs and ex-Green Berets in that world, working for like Middle Eastern monarchies and so forth. And those guys can get paid a lot. The bottom tier guys get paid maybe twice as much as their salary back home, but they don't have any benefits. So if they get hurt, they get bandaged up at the scene, but they get kicked on the street. There's no retirement, there's no et cetera. But at the tier 1 guys, if you're working for like UAE, which everybody wants to work for the UAE because they're really generous, you could be $5,000 a day or something. I mean, I've heard different stories. It's hard to open people's bank statements. So it depends what kind of tier you're in. Those guys, and they're mostly guys, come from someplace. There's no basic training for mercenaries. So they come from a national army, a national intelligence service, a national police service sometimes. That's how they get recruited. And because it's an illicit industry, it's all word of mouth. It's like you have a team, like let's look at the Haiti operation this past summer. You had guys, you had a team leader who calls up his friends in a certain special forces unit in Colombia, which is very good, who had just gotten out saying, I need something, I need you to do something for me. And then he calls out some logistic guys and he says, well, I need you to do something for me. Those two teams did not talk, which is one of the reasons they had problem in Haiti. And that's part of the cutout system. And lastly, I'd say that because it's a word of mouth industry, the way this industry works, it's siloed into 3 groups based on language. You have the Russian speakers, the English speakers, and the Spanish speakers. And then you have some smaller ones like Hebrew and French speakers, but those are the 3 biggest ones. And there's a lot of charlatans in the space. And there's also a lot of adventurism. And when I was in the industry, there's no single reason why people get involved. It's all over the map. People in this industry are complex, just like people outside this industry. But it's a growing industry. And we've seen it grow tremendously in the last 30 years.
And I want to mention that its growth, and something we talked about when we spoke earlier at the conference, was that nation states, and Nick, you alluded to this, are giving up their role as, nation states, to protect your citizens, to protect your borders. And you alluded to this, this return to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Is it possible, or, looking out 20, 25 years, are we going to look very, very different? Is the idea of a nation just not even going to be something that we believe in today?
Well, it's a great question. So this trend, this cleavage between states having the monopoly of force, which is a classic Weberian definition of a state, kind of was started, the cleavage was really accelerated by the United States of America and the Iraq War. Because, as you recall, in 2003, when, the United States went into Iraq, policymakers like Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, VP Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, they thought this would be a short and easy war. I mean, how many times have we heard that in history, right? It'll be a short and easy war. And when it turned out not to be a short and easy war, policymakers were left with three bad political choices. They could either leave Iraq and cede the battlefield to terrorists, which would be political suicide for the Bush administration. They could have a Vietnam-like national draft, because we didn't have enough volunteers to fill the all-volunteer army. But that would have been suicide politically as well. Or they could have made up the difference by hiring contractors. And that's what they did. First a little bit, but as the wars crawled forward, it became a lot of bit. So by the time of 2011, most of our military footprint was contracted. Now, just to be clear, only about 10 to 15% were trigger pullers. Most of those contractors were fixing trucks, cooking food. But like in World War I, or World War II, that was all done by soldiers. So once we had done that, we've de facto legitimized this industry. And we can't wag our finger at Moscow and say, don't use private military contractors. We can't do it to anybody in the world. Also, so that's sort of like, even though it's illegal, people are doing it because of all these sly advantages that I was discussing with Nick. The other thing is that now after the Iraq and Afghanistan war, you have all these out of work contractors who are looking for new work, and that's our problem. Like when I was in graduate school, my thesis advisor was Ash Carter, who became the Secretary of Defense. And I remember way back, I was telling him, what happens to Blackwater when the US is done with using them? And his response, which is really indicative of Washington thought, is that, they'll just go home and become civilians again, as if they're cheap Army reservists from World War II. But that's not what contractors do. They find new clients. And so we're starting to see these contractors who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, most of which were not Americans, turning up in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, in the Congo, in Venezuela, all these hot spots. And they're also starting to work for the private sector. And they're working for, the 0.001% of the global wealthy and multinational companies. And we're going to get to a point in the decades to come where warfare will not just be the exclusive privilege of nation states, but the super rich. And they all have international interests that they will want to defend, regardless of international law. And this is going there. I mean, and already we see this when ExxonMobil pulls in, just to pick on Exxon, it could be Shell Oil. When Shell Oil pulls into the Gulf of Guinea in Africa, do you think that just because they're, quote, sub-state, they don't wield political power over in Nigeria, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea? Of course they wield power. And now they're going to be armed and dangerous because this trend is slowly devolving. And we're going to get back to what really is normal, where warfare is a commodity in a marketplace for force with supply and demand. And it responds not to the laws of war, but to the laws of the marketplace. It's like Clausewitz meets Adam Smith. And that's not how our four stars are thinking about war. They're still thinking about World War II style warfare. They're thinking about a war in the Straits of Taiwan and ignoring all the other things that don't look like war that China is doing, or like the Wagner Group. So that's the future of war, where it's going to become much more messy, where participants will be super rich, not just states. I don't think mercenaries are going to be a threat to the United States of America or Western Europe, but they're going to be a threat. When we think of states, we always think about the top 30 or 40. We never think about the bottom 160. And mercenaries can become a Praetorian Guard in some of them, or take them over, or whatnot. So I think we're going to start to see warfare that will be increasingly privatized, like the Middle Ages, and it will change who, how, and why people fight. That will profoundly change international politics and relations.
And I think that is a great place to end this conversation. I hope we haven't scared our listeners, but given them many things to think about, including perhaps a new career. Nick, I thought you were fishing a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, my pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to both of you.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.